What really went wrong with Mass Effect 3? Mass Effect 3 disappointed lots of people, myself included. Conventional wisdom says the narrative and writing are to blame, especially when it comes to the infamous endings of the game. This popular take has a seductive logic to it. After all, if the writers of the game aren't the ones we should hold most responsible for its story, who else could be? But that's simply wrong. Mass Effect 3 disappointing was an inevitable outcome of design changes that were made after Mass Effect 2. So Bioware's writers aren't to blame for what went wrong with Mass Effect 3. No rewrite can fix the problems with Mass Effect 3 and its endings. Only a redesign can, and I'm here to tell you why. Who am I? I'm not here to dunk on Mass Effect 3 for someone's entertainment. That's just not my style. Personally, I enjoy analyzing stories and games because I think they're uniquely well-suited tools for helping us figure out how to live well. Professionally, I've got a master's degree in philosophy, and my day job is in market research. What all that means is that I'm not just going to argue for my take on Mass Effect 3's controversy and leave it at that. I'm going to consider and respond to the most relevant counter-arguments against the thesis I'm advancing. The only obviously relevant counter-argument I'm not going to be responding to is the idea that Mass Effect 3 was a good ending to the franchise. This opinion used to be rare, but it's no longer as fringe as it once was. So, if you feel that it's the truth, that's actually fine. I'm not going to really be trying to change your mind. I'm going to be leaving that task to you. In this video, I'm going to be assuming you think Mass Effect 3 was a disappointing conclusion, or that you will be thinking that very soon. At the end of the day, I'm just a fan of the Mass Effect franchise. It got me into RPGs. Like only a few weeks ago, I found my old trilogy saves on a USB I've somehow saved since high school. I know my teenage self learned foolish ideas about romance and daddy issues from Mass Effect I had to unlearn years later. Today, I have multiple sets of N7 pajamas because why the fuck not? As a fan, I just want Mass Effect to learn from its mistakes, or at least I want other game designers who are inspired by Mass Effect to learn from the mistakes it made. And all that means I think we need to set the record straight on Mass Effect 3 and show that design mistakes were to blame, not the writing. What D&D and Call of Cthulhu can teach us about the Mass Effect trilogy. A helpful way to start thinking about the relationship between the design or mechanics of a game and its writing or story is by examining RPGs like D&D or Call of Cthulhu. Tabletop RPGs like these have a far more obvious relationship between their mechanics and story than do video games like Mass Effect. We can simply read the rulebooks of tabletop RPGs, but the rules of video games are often obfuscated by their code or interfaces. So let's examine the core rules in the two most recent editions of D&D and Call of Cthulhu. These rules are designed to intentionally restrict the kind of stories the games can easily tell. Comparing the rules helps reveal why a game's story is actually subordinate to its mechanics. You see, D&D at its core is a game of Tolkienian heroics. In the game's current 5th edition, characters shrug off most injuries they receive, recover expended abilities quite literally in their sleep, and gain more health and abilities by winning combat encounters. As a result, this game inspires stories about plucky heroes who excel in progressively more grandiose brawls. In contrast, Call of Cthulhu is a game of Lovecraftian attrition. In the game's current 7th edition, characters exposed to unnerving situations usually lose sanity points. If you lose all your sanity points, this causes madness, which can permanently remove characters from player control. This game naturally inspires stories about imperiled investigators who avoid overwhelming horrors. So, looking at these rules, it's self-evident that D&D and Call of Cthulhu, they're both RPGs, but they're storytelling polar opposites. Each game is designed to tell a genre of story that is incompatible with the other. Tolkienian heroics make no sense in a story world of Lovecraftian attrition, and vice versa. Now, imagine you were playing a character for 200 hours in D&D. Then, in the final 100 hours, you were forced to finish your game and story with Call of Cthulhu's rules. Before, like Tolkien's fantasy heroes, you would pluckily slay unnerving monsters in the beginning and the middle of your story. But in the end, you would, like Lovecraft's unlucky protagonists, become a nervous investigator, warily managing your exposure to horrors. That transition would suck. Combat set pieces you were trained to expect would be traded for spooks and dread. Classic genre story arcs yet to be resolved would be impossible to complete within the new genre. The character you built for one game would struggle to fit into another. No amount of literary finagling and retconning could fix this design-induced storytelling disaster. In sum, it would be a mistake to swap from D&D to Call of Cthulhu because it would frustrate players' role-playing expectations. It would make for an incoherent genre mishmash. A game's story is ultimately subordinate to its mechanics, even if players aren't aware of that. You don't need to be consciously aware of the relationships between the mechanics of the game and its story to have your own gaming experience ruined by a change in game mechanics.
Thinking about RPGs with the MDA framework.
It's easiest to see why this transition from D&D to Call of Cthulhu would suck so much if we think using the MDA framework. The MDA framework is an influential way to analyze game design in terms of player behavior and feelings. MDA stands for Mechanics, Dynamics, and Aesthetics. Mechanics refers to the various gameplay systems and rules within the context of a game. Dynamics are how the mechanics incentivize the player to act in certain ways. Aesthetics are the feelings or story the dynamics cause the player to experience. For example, in D&D, the core mechanics of players recovering most health and abilities through sleep and gaining more health and abilities through fights causes the dynamic of players seeking out fights for empowerment. That creates the aesthetic of Tolkienian heroism. By contrast, in Call of Cthulhu, the core mechanics of losing sanity in unnerving scenarios and losing control of your player character without any remaining sanity causes the dynamic of players avoiding overwhelming horrors. That creates the aesthetic of Lovecraftian attrition. Usually, games have multiple mechanics, dynamics, or aesthetics. Naturally, some are going to be more core to the player's experience than others. You can think of this like the different ingredients in a recipe. Ideally, all of these ingredients are going to complement each other and make for a delicious experience. Clashing ingredients are going to make for a very bad time. A game's story is, in essence, its aesthetics, created by the dynamics, which are in turn created by the mechanics. So, swapping mechanics from D&D to Call of Cthulhu violates players' expectations regardless of the storyteller involved. It doesn't matter who the DM is. Even the best DM couldn't manage this transition well. Because swapping mechanics effectively removes the tools you need as a storyteller to author the story you originally promised. The dynamics of the game are going to radically start to differ, and a new and incompatible aesthetic is going to emerge. It's going to be impossible to pay off the setup from earlier in the game, and you'd just be doomed to end your game with a conclusion that felt irrelevant, even contradictory in fundamental ways. You and the rest of the players might blame your skills as storytellers, without ever realizing it's the new mechanics that are causing the issues. But no amount of story choices or retcons you can make will solve this kind of problem. Poorly timed and substantial enough gameplay changes can make it impossible to end a game's story without disappointing. And to put it bluntly, I think Bioware made a similar mistake with Mass Effect 3.
The key design mistake undermining Mass Effect 3. A new core role-playing mechanic.
Bioware's mistake with Mass Effect 3 was using a different core mechanic for role-playing than Mass Effect 1 and 2. The core mechanic in those old games, Shepard, the player character, usually needs to make mutually exclusive Paragon and Renegade alignment choices. Yes, I know that old-school alignment mechanic is often criticized, and the changes made to this mechanic in Mass Effect 3 are praised by most at time of recording. Indeed, it's one of those things that you can usually find praised about Mass Effect 3 in spite of everything else. At least they improved the old alignment mechanic. So, it may seem absurd for me to suggest that Bioware erred in redesigning that mechanic, even hyperbolic if I'm going to claim that, as I am claiming, that Bioware replaced this mechanic with a new core, because you can see the alignment choices throughout the game, right? Stick with me though, I've got the receipts. Yes, I completely agree the old mechanic was flawed. It needed to be updated by the time Mass Effect 3 came out. But I want to save my analysis of those flaws for a future video, because I'd wager I have a much longer and more detailed criticism of the flaws with this mechanic than most people do. So you're only going to see me gassing up Mass Effect 1 and 2's alignment system in this video, because we really don't need to get into a deep dive of what was working poorly right now. All we need to do is see how this core mechanic was satisfying in Mass Effect 1 and 2. Only then can we see just how incompatible Mass Effect 3 is with the preceding games.
The core role-playing mechanic shaping Mass Effect 1 and 2. Paragon and Renegade choices.
Now, if you've listened this far but don't know anything about the Mass Effect trilogy, I'm quite flattered. I'm very impressed with you, and I'm here to help you out. Here's everything you need to know. In these games, you play as Commander Shepard. And I refer to Shepard as they throughout this video because you can play as a male or a female Shepard. Shepard has a spaceship and crew and takes their crew into combat sequences and can romance some of the crew. Fans love the romances, like really love them, and sometimes tend to think they're the whole reason to play these games. Might not be wrong there, but we won't be talking about that today. The overarching story, though, in these games is that Shepard is trying to prevent the Reapers from destroying the galaxy. The Reapers are, at least in the first two games, framed as Lovecraftian robot Cthulhu figures. And while you're fighting them, while you're stopping them, you make moral decisions that shape the story. That's the gist of Mass Effect. In short, these games are about Cthulhu robots, romance, and ethical choices. Mass Effect 1 and 2's core mechanic simulates moral reasoning. It's inspired by the alignment mechanics of older editions of D&D. The end result of designing a game around moral reasoning is that you get a choose-your-own-adventure game where you're shepherding the universe into mutually exclusive moral alignments, the way of the Paragon or Renegade. Just look at how the first game ends. A Renegade sacrifices alien politicians to launch a human supremacist coup. In contrast, a Paragon sacrifices human lives to defend the multiracial government. And Mass Effect 2, it ends very similarly. A Renegade gives cutting-edge technology to human supremacists, but a Paragon refuses to. These obviously aren't morally ambiguous decisions, and that's the damn point. The ethical difference is as unmistakable as the pulsating scars on Renegade Shepard's ugly mug. You aren't playing as Geralt of Rivia in The Witcher, making two questionably gray choices. You're choosing between two things that are clearly and distinctly different at all times. Now, more generally, any choice framed as having major consequences is usually a mutually exclusive one between these two moralities. This core mechanic does two cool aesthetic things. It gives players the power fantasy of being a righteous badass, someone whose ethics literally save the universe. And at the same time, the player is also being empowered with the agency to decide the moral of the story. Basically, you get to shape the meaning of Mass Effect 1 and 2. It's why, despite all the valid criticisms of this design's shortcomings, these RPGs are still so beloved today. This alignment mechanic, this making these two choices, it's the secret sauce. It simulates moral reasoning, this core mechanic. It creates the intoxicating feeling that you authored the story's meaning. Now, unfortunately, Mass Effect 3 isn't designed around this alignment mechanic. The change is very subtle though, so most people fail to notice it. As a result, only a few video game critics, I've seen, say, Luke Plunkett for example, even notice this change happen, though Luke Plunkett only notices this change in the endings. But the endings of Mass Effect 3 are very distracting. To paraphrase H. Bomber Guy in his quite lovely analysis of Deus Ex Human Revolution, check it out if you like that game and want to think about it, but to paraphrase a point he was making there that I think is relevant about Mass Effect, it seems like Mass Effect 3's endings were so memorably bad, they distracted most of us from noticing the design flaws which undermine the entire RPG. But if we stop fixating on the ending's writing, we can see the game was made to lack the old style of mutually exclusive alignment paths in all of its parts, not just the ending. So here's a chart showing what choices the player can make under certain conditions. Consider the first act. Depending upon the circumstances, Paragons can cure the genophage or sabotage the cure. Renegades may only sabotage the cure, which is a little weird, isn't it? Paragons can resolve the situation in one of two ways, but Renegades only one way. Later, in the second act, choices are also not exclusive to the old alignment paths. It gets weirder. Now, alignments have the same choices in front of them. Both alignments can make peace between the Geth and the Quarians, assuming you filled out the necessary conditions. Sacrificing either race is not an alignment choice. In the finale, things are not any different. Don't be duped by the color coding. Synthesis, destruction, control, and refusal, none of the endings are Paragon or Renegade. The user interface is used to trick you into thinking the old school alignment system is still in play in the first and the second act, though it's working in a way that's completely unlike prior games. But in the third act, the mask, it comes off. There's no interface even coding the various endings of Mass Effect 3. This game, it's just not about moral alignments. The game, therefore, doesn't offer meaningful choices in the way the old games once did. So, all of Mass Effect 3's major choices fail to fit the mold of the old design. In this game, mutually exclusive paths are out, and moral ambiguity is in. This new style is a feature, though, not a bug. Bioware didn't forget the secret sauce. They thought it shouldn't be in the Mass Effect 3 recipe.
Bioware intentionally designed Mass Effect 3 to be unlike Mass Effect 1 and 2.
Bioware wanted to create a new and morally ambiguous aesthetic for Mass Effect 3. We know this because of an interview and press release from Patrick Weeks. Patrick Weeks was a writer on the entire trilogy. In the interview, Weeks notes that he is happy that Mass Effect 3 moved away from one or the other choices designed as Paragon and Renegade ones. Here's the interview.
One of the things I was really happy with in Mass Effect 3 is that when we had a lot of one or the other type choices, we moved away from saying this one is obviously Paragon and this one is obviously Renegade. We never really meant for Paragon or Renegade to be good guy versus bad guy, but rightly or wrongly, whatever we intended, people really felt like Paragon was good guy and Renegade was bad guy. And so we moved away from calling, hey, the Renegade option is destroy the Geth, the Paragon option is save the Geth, and just moved it to two neutral choices to let the player make their own moral decision about which one was the right one.
So, similarly to that interview, in a press release right before Mass Effect 3 came out, Weeks was proud to document the design choice to remove in-game incentives to commit to a moral path, because this would create a Mass Effect 3 with difficult and morally ambiguous decisions.
If you played Mass Effect 2, a lot of this will seem familiar. The key differences are, there's no penalty for mixing Paragon and Renegade. You're still rewarded for being a completionist player and doing as much content as you can, but you can do it as a Paragon or Renegade player without penalty. Our new and improved system gives you a game with so many difficult and morally ambiguous decisions. As our lead designer, Preston Watamanuik, said, "This may be the first time I've ever played a game with a morality system and come out morally gray."
In sum, Bioware designed this game to lack mutually exclusive moral paths and cut the incentives to stick to a moral path. These mechanical changes reflect Bioware's intended morally ambiguous aesthetic for Mass Effect 3. In keeping with this new aesthetic, Mass Effect 3 was designed around a new and different core mechanic than the old moral binary.
The core role-playing mechanic shaping Mass Effect 3, war assets and total military strength.
Collecting total military strength, or TMS for short, is the core role-playing mechanic in Mass Effect 3. TMS is a number representing war assets to fight the Reapers with. You know, things like Dextro rations, Asari commandos, Vorcha fighter wings, and Volus bombing fleets. In the very end, TMS is the primary mechanic that determines what choices you can make, not Shepard's morality. As a result, this game primarily tells stories about min-maxing war assets to survive Armageddon. So, even though Shepard still makes some Paragon and Renegade choices in Mass Effect 3, doing so is no longer central to the role-playing experience. The most consequential choices in Mass Effect 3 are about TMS, because TMS is the new core role-playing mechanic. Simply put, making alignment choices isn't the focus of your gameplay anymore. Min-maxing TMS is. Now, in fairness, this design isn't a bad idea per se. A TMS first design would not just be unproblematic, but actually lots of fun if implemented in a standalone RPG. Think The Witcher 3. The Witcher 3 is a commercial and critical darling, and its role-playing is all about making morally ambiguous decisions. Your choices are usually tracked in the background in a way similar to how Mass Effect 3's TMS system works. To give just one example, the ending for Ciri in The Witcher 3 is determined by a bunch of parenting choices you make, which the game tallies. If you meet hidden point thresholds, you get different endings. With too few points, she dies, and enough, she lives, etc., etc. Empress Ciri is the only good ending. I'm joking. All this to say, a TMS-style design can work well in a standalone RPG. The Witcher 3's beloved status shows there's nothing fundamentally wrong with this design as a core role-playing mechanic. And that's actually why, if you want the best chance to enjoy Mass Effect 3 and what the TMS system does so well, play it vanilla. By vanilla, I mean without importing choices from Mass Effect 1 and 2. As a standalone RPG, Mass Effect 3 tells a coherent, consistent, and satisfying story. It's not a story I particularly like, but I think that if you approach it from a craft level, it's perfectly good. I've actually co-written an article analyzing this unique experience if you're curious. Link in the doobly-doo. Anyway, enough of that hypothetical. Because it's just a huge problem that Mass Effect 3 works best as a standalone RPG, because it isn't one, or at least it wasn't supposed to be one. Mass Effect 3 is the conclusion to an RPG trilogy, which was pitched and marketed on the promise your choices would go across the games. So if the first two games mechanically defined player agency through binary alignment paths, it means the third game was the wrong time for a drastic design change. At best, designing a finale around a new core mechanic sets it up to subvert expectations, and probably not in the good way. At worst, a new core mechanic will provoke disappointment for many, which is, I think, exactly what happened.
Why the TMS first design was a huge mistake that set Mass Effect 3 up to disappoint.
In practice, not designing Mass Effect 3 around alignment choices makes it hard to honor the promises older games made. One example of this is so silly it's surreal. So, regardless of your morality, Shepard always foils Udina and Cerberus's human supremacist coup come Mass Effect 3. Mind you, this happens even if you played as a renegade in Mass Effect 1 and did a human supremacist coup with Udina.
The Council was always holding us back. When I saw the opportunity to get rid of them, I took it.
Good God, Shepard. How can you even say that?
Don't act so surprised, Captain. We all know it's true. Sacrificing the Council assured our victory over Sovereign. The end justified the means. We humans understand that. It's what makes us stronger than the others.
What are you saying?
The galaxy needs leadership, real leadership. When a crisis hits, we can't be paralyzed by debate like the old Council. The new Council must rule with a single voice. It must be assembled from one species alone, humanity.
The rest of the galaxy isn't just going to bow down because we tell them to. We'll need the fleets to bring them in line.
Yeah, Mass Effect 3 ignores your old human supremacist coup, and it doesn't let you do another one now. This is a retcon, and this retcon of player agency is patently absurd. A renegade Shepard insensibly betraying Udina is top 10 anime betrayals nonsense. Imagine what's going through Udina's mind if you went renegade before, but now you aren't backing him up. This is probably the surrealist thing Mass Effect 3 makes happen because of the switch to TMS from the old alignment system. Maybe how Mass Effect 3 handles your choices with Arachni is more surreal. There is, after all, always somehow some sort of Arachni queen in Mass Effect 3. Even if you were playing as a renegade in Mass Effect 1 and killed the entire species. A renegade really has to question their sanity in Mass Effect 3, as their signature choices are retconned left and right. These surreal moments with Udina and the Arachni Queen in Mass Effect 3, yeah, they are unique to a renegade playthrough of the series, but they're not an accident. They're just the most visible symptoms of the systemic way TMS struggles to reward the alignment-based expectations older games set. A less noticeable, but even more important symptom is how Mass Effect 3 quantifies prior games' ending choices. The previous games, how they ended, they were the most important alignment choices. At least that's the impression you're given in virtue of the fact that they are the final alignment choices you make in the game. But you'd hardly think that these choices mattered from the TMS they're given in Mass Effect 3. That's right. If you do the math, the TMS barely differs. It's a net 15 TMS difference at the theoretical most. As you can see in this chart, if you went Paragon at the end of Mass Effect 1, you get 70 war assets from saving the Destiny Ascension, as well as 125 war assets from the Solarian Third Fleet. The Alliance 1st, 3rd, and 5th fleets all lose 25 war assets because you traded them to save the Council. But if you went Renegade at the end of Mass Effect 1, you get 25 war assets from Admiral Mikhailovich and 70 war assets from an STG task force. Why? I guess Mikhailovich got some more experience in this version of the Battle of the Citadel, but who can say with the STG task force? Why do Solarians help you more in the war if you sacrifice their counselor? That seems a little bit backwards. It's almost like TMS numbers are a poor way to translate your old alignment choices. Anyway, when it comes to Mass Effect 2, if you go Paragon at the end and destroy the collector base, you get 100 war assets from the Reaper Heart. This heart is salvaged from the baby Reaper you killed at the end of the game. But if you went Renegade there, it's 110 war assets for a Reaper brain. I suppose the idea here is that you can get a slightly more choice organ from the Reaper corpse if you kept the base. But if you add all this up, prepare to be let down. The net TMS difference between playing exclusively as a Paragon or Renegade across both games, it's only equal to a piffling 15 TMS. It's hard to appreciate how pathetic 15 TMS is. The 15 TMS is super trivial when compared to other war assets. Just one Volus engineering team is worth 50 TMS. Yeah, that's right, some random Volus engineers are 3 times more important to the war effort than Shepard's old alignment choices. These Volus aren't even biotic gods, but these short kings matter more than whether Shepard saved or destroyed the collector base. And all it takes to recruit these little scamps is one planet scan, and that planet scan, it takes literal seconds. And unfortunately, it's just as easy to find other more valuable war assets with similarly little effort. It's hard to overstate how small 15 TMS is when you start to look into it. I think the easiest way, though, is compare 15 TMS to the maximum TMS that you can acquire in an optimized run, which is over 8,000 TMS. Mathematically, that means that 15 TMS is not even equal to a mere 1% of the maximum TMS a player can rack up. So you could say that it makes less than a 1% difference on Mass Effect 3 what you did at the end of Mass Effect 1 and 2. Those are the numbers. By the numbers, a net 15 TMS difference is just chump change. It's inconsequential. And that's not a subjective literary take about what makes for good or bad ending or what I wanted out of Mass Effect 3. To paraphrase Garrus, that's just the ruthless calculus of the numbers. And this math, it's just bad news for Mass Effect 3 and its ability to meet a returning player's expectations. It means the choices that Mass Effect 1 and 2 implied would have the most noticeable consequences actually don't whatsoever. In effect, the narrative promise the old alignment system made, it's broken by the new TMS system. And as we've seen, this isn't an isolated narrative boo-boo. Mass Effect 3's TMS design makes it struggle to fulfill older story promises. Alignment can't matter like it once did, probably because you can't reduce moral reasoning to spreadsheets without losing something in translation. And if all that undermines the player experience, tough luck. That's just the cost of a TMS first design. The biggest cost, though, of a TMS first design, it's the elephant in the room. You know it, I know it. It's the Mass Effect 3 ending controversy. Sure, Bioware's writing is usually blamed for that, but their writing and story choices aren't the true culprit. As the video game critic Luke Plunkett perceptively noted in 2012, the design choice not to use the binary best explains why the infamous endings frustrate so many.
The lack of Mass Effect 1 and 2 style Paragon and Renegade ending choices feels like walking 100 miles to get lemonade, only to get there and be told you can choose between a pair of shoes, some brass knuckles, or a cheeseburger. BioWare's failure here, then, isn't in terms of its story writing, or its pacing, or that Shepard dies. Indeed, my Shepard clearly didn't die. It lies in changing the way the game's most important decisions, the very thing that gamers were so invested in, are made at the 11th hour.
Luke Plunkett gets something right and a few things wrong here. Plunkett is right to say the lack of alignment endings are the problem. But he doesn't seem to realize that's because of the new TMS system, and he also doesn't seem to realize that this new design isn't a unique blight on the endings of the game. It's present in all of the game. As we've seen, all of Mass Effect 3, not just the end, is designed around TMS. It's not so surprising Plunkett only noticed this design change at the end, though. And again, to give him credit, he's the only person I can see in writing who has even noticed it to begin with. And it makes sense that you'd notice it here, because this is the only point where Mass Effect 3's user interface makes no effort to even ape the old alignment system. Like, your final choices aren't even put within the conversation wheel and framed as Paragon or Renegade anymore. And obviously, both of the prior games at the very end, they did just that. They trained us to expect to select alignments right there. So it's really noticeable when the final moments of Mass Effect 3 don't match up with the gameplay design of the final moments of the prior games. And as a result, in unmistakable contrast, Mass Effect 3 violates your old expectations. It denies you the kind of agency you've been trained to expect. Your choice of endings is just primarily dictated by your TMS score. So it's not surprising so many returning players felt the game took control away from them. That wasn't an inaccurate opinion. It's just kind of how it is. Players have a noticeable lack of agency over the meaning of this game compared to the prior ones. And it's just the easiest to see this change at the very end of the game, and that's probably why the endings are so reviled, even though the rest of the game people tend to think is mid or great. The thing is, choosing the moral of the story across multiple games was literally the point of the older games. It's what sold the franchise. So more than anything else, the TMS system, it's why the endings disappoint. This new mechanic forces you to feel like all your old morality choices were mostly irrelevant. Because in truth, in Mass Effect 3, they are pretty much entirely irrelevant. This is the inevitable effect of the switch to the TMS mechanic. It's tempting to try and find a silver lining here, and I generally think that's a good idea, and argue something like Mass Effect 2 and 3 dev Dorian Keegan and say that the issues with Mass Effect 3's endings don't harm the rest of the story as an ending to the series.
I think overall, people didn't appreciate how much Mass Effect 3 was the end journey in itself. Stories that started in the first Mass Effect and evolved in Mass Effect 2 were being tied up during the game. Add to that the integration of the first Mass Effect and Mass Effect 2 saves, and I think Mass Effect 3 was a great ending in itself.
In other words, someone like Dorian Keegan thinks Mass Effect 3 is a good ending because the true ending of Mass Effect 3 is the journey along the way, not the destination. I can personally empathize with why a developer, critic, or fan of this game wants to focus on the positives. If it wouldn't take this video so far off topic and out of scope, I could easily go on a digression for the next hour or so about all the small isolated things I like about Mass Effect 3's story. And Mass Effect 3, it does deserve praise for where it does things well. There's just been too much ire directed at this game and Bioware over the years for them trying to do their best and just happening to disappoint people. But overeagerness to focus on the positive can ignore unpleasant truths. So Dorian Keegan's argument, it's now pretty common after the release of Mass Effect Legendary Edition, but it's also just copium. I'm afraid it's a thought-terminating cliche. It's intellectually dodgy to respond to criticism of a story's ending by redefining other parts of the story as the ending, not the endings being criticized. Still, I've seen more robust and influential versions of Keegan's argument made by insightful video game critics like Phil Savage and Stacey Henley. Ultimately, even these improved and more popular versions of Keegan's argument suffer from the same flaw. A cheery journey and destination argument like Dorian Keegan's fixates on isolated narrative beats and ignores the design of the whole game. We shouldn't miss the forest for the trees, though. The unfortunate reality is that however cheerily we define the journey and the destination, they both follow the same damn TMS blueprint. This is true in the small side quests, the fan favorite moments with crewmates, the big plot points and twists, and the infamous endings. Mass Effect 3 is all about TMS, not the moral paths which once defined Shepard. Shepard is now a ruthless asset manager, counting stocks, a sort of Wolf of Wall Street, seeking big numbers to maximize the odds of a Reaper defeat. This spreadsheety min-maxing experience, it's what defines consequential role-playing in Mass Effect 3. Sadly, this design harms the entire story's ability to meet a returning player's expectations, not just its finale. Overall, the new focus on TMS makes the old alignment mechanic seem stupid. My favorite example of this occurs in the Citadel DLC. In it, the Alpha Chad James Vega can challenge Shepard to beat his record of 182 consecutive pull-ups. You can beat this record if you press alternating Paragon and Renegade interrupts a total of 183 times. So you'll be sitting there pressing buttons in real life for a little over 13 minutes if you want to show Vega that you're the best around and no one's ever going to take you down. This is a comically slow scene. It's got lots of weird grunting. I think Jennifer Hale and Mark Meir, the voice actors for Commander Shepard, must have had a lot of fun recording this sequence, and it's worth watching if you haven't seen it. The thing, though, is that this scene strips the alignment mechanic of all its old aesthetics with a new pull-up dynamic. It's very much a forget those ethical dilemmas, bro. It's time to get swole moment. So, Mass Effect 3, it's oddly willing to reduce a previously fundamental mechanic, the thing that defined consequential role-playing. It's happy to turn it into a tedious dynamic of 183 button mashes. Effectively, this is Mass Effect 3 mocking Mass Effect 1 and 2's role-playing. The old alignment mechanic is now just a bad joke. This is kind of like Don Quixote to King Arthur. So it's no exaggeration to say Mass Effect 3's design subtly but surely rejects a returning player's expectations about their agency. It denies them the old influence they expect. Once players were invited to ethically reason about which one of two contrasting alignments was wisest, in the end, they're incentivized to do, whatever, so long as number get big.
It's a fundamental difference between Mass Effect 3 and Mass Effect 1 and 2.
Simply put, Mass Effect 1 and 2 are fundamentally different RPGs than Mass Effect 3. This is an inevitable result of the fact that different core mechanics drive each game's story. Mass Effect 1 and 2's core mechanic cares about moral reasoning. All major choices are explicitly framed as Paragon or Renegade ones. Players quite literally choose the moral of the story. Shepard never lets fear compromise their idea of justice, whatever their alignment. You're gonna feel like a righteous badass messianically saving the universe no matter what alignment you choose. Mass Effect 1 and 2 promise that there's always gonna be two recognizable ways to fix everything. In contrast, Mass Effect 3's core mechanic cares about moral ambiguity. Alignment choices don't define everything anymore. What matters most is TMS. Only might is gonna make right, so it's time to whip out your abacus. Shepard's principles are another casualty of the Reaper War. You're gonna feel that wisdom can't be anything more than making prudent choices in this game. Mass Effect 3, in that sense, is a cautionary tale about how highfalutin ethical scruples are irrelevant when shit hits the fan. In the end, these contrasting designs undermine each other. The first two games make the third seem unjustifiably cynical, and the third game makes the first two seem naively moralistic. These different aesthetics of Mass Effect mingle very awkwardly. They're far more like strangers rather than friends.
It's time to respond to popular and relevant counterarguments.
My point is not that one of these styles of Mass Effect is better. That's subjective. If you like one of them more than the other, that's good for you. I'm also not saying that Bioware should not have tried to improve the old binary, because it had problems, and I'm going to talk about them later in another video. Finally, I'm also not saying that I think that Bioware was trying to sabotage the finale. They obviously had good intentions and weren't trying to disappoint people. What I'm saying, though, is that Bioware replacing the trilogy's core gameplay mechanic with a new one set the finale up to disappoint. Generally, if you train expectations within 2 acts of the story and then violate them in the final act, you usually create a dissatisfying experience. And that's just an ironclad rule of storytelling, one which, when violated, sets stories up to disappoint. Recall how much it would suck if, while playing D&D, you were forced to end your story in Call of Cthulhu. This would undermine your agency and make your story incoherent whether you preferred the mechanics of Call of Cthulhu or D&D. The aesthetic of Tolkienian heroism, it's just incompatible with the aesthetic of Lovecraftian nutrition. These are completely... maybe one of these could be a small flavor in the other, but they can't both be the primary flavors in a game. You could sort of think about it like, you could have 2 different foods you love, but taste awful when you eat them together, right? And the problem isn't that either of these foods are bad or that you dislike them. It's that it's unwise to combine these specific flavors and textures of these foods. And similarly, the more a player enjoys either aesthetic or mechanic, the worse the switch between these things is going to feel. Sadly, Mass Effect 3's TMS first design harms players' agency, and it also harms the trilogy's coherence. Changing the core role-playing mechanic in the finale of a trilogy was why it disappointed so many. Design choices, not writing choices, truly set Mass Effect 3 up to fail. Still, over the years, I've seen fans develop many alternative explanations as to why Mass Effect 3 proved so disappointing and to so many. And usually these explanations focus on the writing, not the design. So I think it's appropriate to respond to these arguments. It's going to clarify my own and why it matters. One of the most common takes on why Mass Effect 3 disappointed focuses on Bioware's perceived recklessness. This is the Bioware was doomed as they didn't create and follow a detailed plan argument. It goes like this. Mass Effect 3 was doomed to disappoint because, despite Bioware's goal of creating a trilogy of games where the choices go between them, they chose not to plan out the story. The closest Bioware came to doing this was the vague concept of a dark energy crisis. I'm not going to detail this idea here because other people have, and there's actually not a lot of details on this idea. It's just kind of like a vague outline for how you maybe end the story. Anyway, suffice it to say, the dark energy idea, it's lacking in specifics, and it was scrapped. You can find some setup for it in Mass Effect 1 and 2, but it goes nowhere because the writing team ultimately decided it wasn't the direction they're going. So this one idea that Bioware's writers had at some point to tie the games together was not really concrete or specific. In other words, Bioware was flying by the seat of their pants. They followed no detailed outline for Mass Effect 2 while they penned the first game, nor did they do the same for the third game while they wrote Mass Effect 2. In effect, they were making things up as they went along. They responded to the fans. That's why, for example, Garrus became romanceable in Mass Effect 2. There was a lot of desire to romance that scaly little Turian, and people were into it. And you should try it sometime if you haven't. Anyway, and getting back to the argument, the basic claim here is that Bioware didn't plan to execute on a plan, so Mass Effect 3 is arguably set up to fail, right? Because you can sort of see how if I say I'm going to create a trilogy of games, and then you also say I'm not going to come up with a plan, you might say, well, how can this be a good trilogy, right? I think the more you already think about writing as a craft, the more easily you'll see why this is a bad argument already. Bioware deciding to pants rather than plot the trilogy doesn't guarantee they'd be unable to write a satisfying game concluding it. I'm using this distinction between pantsing and plotting. It basically refers to the idea of writers who fly by the seat of their pants versus writers who plot everything out. These are different approaches to writing. Either one can serve you. I think most writers have a preferred style. I'm definitely a pantser, but neither of these is better in some simple way. They're just different approaches. Ultimately, lacking a detailed narrative plan doesn't mean Bioware was guaranteed to write a more dissatisfying game. We all know satisfying storytelling franchises which just made shit up as they went along, without any plan at all, just responded to audience feedback, and it worked. And I'm certain we also all know many pre-plotted storytelling franchises which are a dissatisfying mess. And given that, it's pretty much the case that plans about where a story is going to go just aren't necessary for writing a satisfying ending. They could help, they might not help. So it's just irrelevant if Bioware was writing by the seat of their pants or if they had plotted out all along. Mass Effect 3 disappointed for other reasons than Bioware's choice to pants rather than plot the trilogy. I'd say another argument that is even more common than the last and is a bit new. It's sort of unique to the release of Mass Effect Legendary Edition. I hardly ever saw it before that game was released. But it basically goes like this. It's this idea that Bioware was sort of clumsy authorially. And this is a literary argument. It's got a lot more meat on it than the last one. And this is basically the Mass Effect 3 was narratively set up to fail by Mass Effect 2 argument. I've seen a version of this made by a pretty prolific writer on the Mass Effect franchise, Kenneth Shepard, which is very creative. It's not very well known. I have the same issues with it I actually do with a much more popular version of this argument, which was made by Seamus Young. I see that most fans using this whole, hey, Mass Effect 2 set Mass Effect 3 up to fail argument are implicitly using the one by Seamus Young, not the one by Kenneth Shepard. But shout out to Kenneth Shepard. It's a cool argument. I just don't think it works. So anyway, looking at Seamus Young, he wrote this. This guy wrote a 50-part retrospective on Mass Effect. So if you like reading about Mass Effect, boy, does this guy have you covered. And he very influentially wrote in one of his pieces, and it's really good.
Mass Effect 2 didn't just fail to use the ideas of Mass Effect 1. It actively made it harder for the writer to resolve the trilogy in a satisfying way. No matter how you end the series, it was always going to feel rushed, arbitrary, and contrived, because Mass Effect 3, the ending, didn't get any build-up or foreshadowing in Mass Effect 2, the middle entry of the trilogy.
Basically, Young's point is that because Mass Effect 2 didn't write proper setup, it doomed the payoff in the ending to feel rushed and unsatisfying. There's definitely something to this. I'm very sympathetic to literary arguments like this one by Seamus Young or the one by Kenneth Shepard. I've spent hours grinding my teeth while rewriting Mass Effect 3 because of just how hard Mass Effect 2 makes the writer's job. Young is definitely onto something. Mass Effect 2 did too little to help develop ideas from Mass Effect 1 and set up the story for Mass Effect 3. Mass Effect 2 isn't a second act which does the third act a lot of favors. But nonetheless, I'd say Young and others like him are tending to overstate these problems' importance. They're focusing too much on a literary analysis, and they're ignoring the core design changes in the trilogy. Young is surely right that story-wise, Mass Effect 2 could have better built upon its prequel and better foreshadowed its sequel. And so in that sense, yeah, Mass Effect 2 certainly flawed. And Young, very insightful in his analysis of those flaws. I'm very indebted to him personally in how I'm thinking about rewriting Mass Effect 3. But it just goes so far, way too far, to claim that we should think that Mass Effect 2 didn't give Mass Effect 3 the tools to tell a satisfying ending. Because for all its faults, Mass Effect 2's story was still defined by the alignment mechanic. Mass Effect 3's choice to abandon that mechanic, not Mass Effect 2's writing, is why Mass Effect 3 reliably disappoints so many. After all, bad writing choices in Mass Effect 2 only make it harder to write Mass Effect 3 well. But Mass Effect 3's TMS first design makes it impossible to write a story that pays off the old alignment design. Design choices, they're far subtler than dramatic literary choices. They're less easy to notice. But they far more convincingly explain why Mass Effect 3 reliably disappoints so many of us. There's one more popular argument that I want to consider. It's probably the most popular one I see. And I'd say it's a sour grapes argument. I think it's just smart-sounding despair. And it really just focuses on the perceived impossibility of actually ending an RPG well. And so even though I think this is probably the weakest argument, I think it's still worth considering because it's probably the most common one I see. This sour grapes argument, hell, it's been made by Bioware staff themselves, specifically Mass Effect 3 senior writer Neil Polner. This is the Bioware could never write enough satisfying endings to please players argument. In the pessimistic and influential words of Neil Polner,
I'll say this. When you've given the player 3 massive games where they've been able to make complex decisions that help to shape their version of the story/galaxy/character, the prospect of definitively ending such an epic and wide-ranging experience is never going to be able to ring true. There's no way to tightly wrap up something that's been accumulating and branching and growing for so long like that. When you give people deep choices throughout the experience, I think any ending that doesn't allow for an incomprehensible amount of variation is going to disappoint.
In other words, many people, even one of Mass Effect 3's writers, believe the writers were set up to fail. In short, the argument is that Bioware's writers didn't have the time or resources. They had to disappoint many as their task was impossible. This argument, though, it just doesn't work. Yes, we should note that Bioware had a difficult and unenviable task given the limited development time for Mass Effect 3. If you look at the timelines, it seems EA gave Bioware less than 2 years to make Mass Effect 3 because some of the development time for Mass Effect 3 was lost while they were also held accountable for making DLC for Mass Effect 2. So, in other words, like zooming back, Bioware was given less time to make Mass Effect 3 than they were given to make Mass Effect 2. Which is wild, because they're given less time to make Mass Effect 3, but they're supposed to make Mass Effect 3 so that it could take into account branching choices from Mass Effect 1 and 2. That's a recipe for being set up to crunch. That's a recipe for being set up to suffer. It's just bad management. It's foolish to think that Bioware was asked to create exponentially more than prior games, but with less time and resources. That's just not a task that one can hope to easily do well, or maybe even do well at all. So, I think in that sense, EA was certainly penny wise and pound foolish. Their unrealistic project management, their desire to prioritize short-term financial gains, their disinterest in the long-term health of the franchise, all of that's no small part of why Mass Effect 3 disappointed, that's for damn certain. So, it's actually arguably commendable what Bioware did with Mass Effect 3 given the time and resources they had. Things had to be a brutal rush for the devs. You know, in that sense, it kind of reminds me a little bit of Metal Gear Solid 5, right? You know, that story just at a certain point ends. Konami stopped funding the development of it. And it's really impressive with what it does, with what it has. But the way the game is managed has influenced a lot of what's there, right? But let's not lose track of our original argument. What did Mass Effect 3 need to do to stand a chance at satisfying many? Because even if we just said a bunch of things that are true, and I do think they're true, it doesn't really seem like they guarantee Mass Effect 3 would fail. By definition, I think we can agree that no reasonable amount of time or resources would be enough for Bioware to write an incomprehensible amount of variation in their endings. An infinite amount of time and resources is needed to make an incomprehensible amount of endings. And if that's what Mass Effect 3 needed to satisfy, yeah, I agree, it was doomed to fail. But lacking an incomprehensible amount of endings just isn't really a problem with Mass Effect 3. Mass Effect 3 was not doomed to fail because its writers only wrote 3 or 4 endings, nor because Bioware did not write an infinite amount of endings. After all, the previous games only had 2 endings apiece. Those RPGs had what Neil Polner characterized as an incomprehensible amount of player choice baked into them. But I think very few people would argue that those games were doomed to disappoint because they ended with insufficient player choice. So what's up here? Well, the truth of the matter is that there's just not an incomprehensible amount of meaningful choice in Mass Effect 1 and 2. Not all choices mattered equally. The unimportant choices, well, there were an incomprehensible amount of those. The important choices, all of them fit within mutually exclusive alignment paths. So it's no surprise that replacing the old core mechanic with a new and clashing TMS core mechanic made the finale frustrate many returning players. In the end, if you start with a bad design, no amount of time or resources given to writers can fix that problem. Writers can only work on the story. They can't fix the design itself. Yeah, I mean, you could maybe argue in response to me that in theory, if you gave Bioware more time or resources, that would have helped. But I think that would only be true if that made Bioware realize it was a bad idea to use the TMS mechanic for Mass Effect 3 instead of the old school alignment choices. Because if you don't realize that that's a huge problem, you're just going to make a more polished version of the original Mass Effect 3, but with the same fatally flawed design, which is still going to disappoint people in pretty much the same exact way. Yeah, I mean, little things would be better. You'd get less reused art assets. You'd maybe see more detail on the consequences for TMS choices. But you'd end up in the same place without alignment choices driving the story. Any TMS first version of Mass Effect 3 is going to disappoint after the prior alignment first games. So, I mean, maybe Bioware could have caught their TMS mistake with more time. Who can say? Personally, I doubt it. I mean, it seems like the TMS mistake is very subtle and it's easy to overlook. And I think that there was and is a lot of pressure ever since Mass Effect 1 and 2 to give in to this conventional wisdom that the old school alignment mechanics were hopelessly boring, a relic of outdated game design. I mean, the amount of criticism that these mechanics received after 1 and 2 is probably the most consistent point of criticism across those games. So there is a lot of cultural pressure to say, hey, this bad can't be good. I mean, I've been hyperfixating on this franchise for a decade, and I only just noticed this thing, you know. The change from TMS, it's not self-evident. If it seems easy to spot now, that's because hindsight is 20/20. Ultimately, the alternative explanations that we've just considered, all three of them, they have the same flaws. These popular arguments about why Mass Effect 3 disappoints. All of them are busy pointing fingers at literary causes, and they're pointing fingers at things that are actually design problems. This fundamental misdiagnosis harms the Bioware was doomed because they had no plan argument. It's the same mistake in the Mass Effect 3 was narratively set up to fail by Mass Effect 2 argument. And the same flaw ruins the Bioware could never write enough satisfying endings to please players argument. If none of these arguments hold up under pressure, it's because they fixate on the wrong thing. They start with a bad assumption about the importance of writing. They more or less assume that the mechanics of a game matter less than the writing for the player experience. To see, again, just how wild this is, imagine that you wanted to analyze why you and many others were really disappointed by a movie you saw recently. And let's imagine that you have a friend that you saw the movie with, and your friend is like, okay, I can explain what went so wrong and why so many people hate this if we just count the amount of periods and commas in the movie script. I don't care how clever your friend is. I really doubt that you or most of us would be persuaded by that argument. I think we have an intuitive sense that that's just fixating on the wrong thing. Because, like, yeah, I guess the number of periods and commas in a movie script do influence the movie. But obviously, at this point, I think we all have enough cultural awareness of how movies work. We have enough literacy in that genre to say that there's other more important causes that drive us to feel things when we see a movie. And I feel in that sense that anyone who's trying to explain to you why Mass Effect 3 disappointed by diagnosing literary causes rather than design causes, they're making a similar kind of mistake. They're blaming the periods and the commas, so to speak. They're ignoring the more important things, you know, like we could imagine, like, say, the director or the actor's choices, the whole script, the lighting, the costuming, the set design, and so on. They're blaming what's easy to see and therefore measure and therefore hold responsible, but they're not actually looking at what matters, the things that really drive how we feel about what we're encountering. And like this fact or not, designers end up shaping the story of a video game far more than many writers can hope to.
So it wasn't the writing. Design changes are what set Mass Effect 3 up to fail.
Mass Effect 3's writers were not doomed to disappoint us. The actual problem was that Bioware intentionally but unwisely broke the mold of the moral binary. Mass Effect 3 sidelined the core mechanic that Mass Effect 1 and 2 trained players to expect, replacing it with a new and incompatible core mechanic. That's why it disappoints so many. So, in a sense, yeah, Mass Effect 3's writers were set up to fail, but only because of unwise design choices. I feel this should go without saying, but I am now on the internet, and I am now provocatively arguing about a controversial subject, a subject that has inspired some to issue death threats against Bioware employees in the past. So, I do feel it is right to briefly say, don't be cruel. I don't support you if your takeaway from this video is that you should start dogpiling on the designers of Mass Effect instead of the historically dogpiled writers and developers. You've perverted my point if any kind of pitchfork is your conclusion, and I encourage you to self-reflect, not threaten people. Ask yourself, what's going on with me? Why are you so unforgiving of other people's perceived mistakes? I'm certain you feel you make mistakes too, right? Do you really want to live your life as someone that thinks people should die if they make a mistake? That seems like a cruel way to treat others and yourself. No one deserves that. Ultimately, the point I hope you take away is that any critique of Mass Effect 3's story that ignores its changes to role-playing is fixated on isolated dramatic effects rather than their subtler systemic causes. No amount of rewrites or retcons can fix issues that result from ill-timed and substantial enough gameplay changes. No team of writers could hope to fix Mass Effect 3. A team of designers could, though. I think it helps here to loosely paraphrase the philosopher David Hume. Hume totally would have been a video essayist if that were a thing in the 18th century, because I think the writers of a video game are and ought only to be the servants of the designers of the game, and should not imagine themselves doing anything other than supporting the designers. Writers should see themselves as followers in video game storytelling. In this medium, designers set the fundamental creative constraints. Writers fill in the blanks dictated by the mechanics. In hindsight, given all that, it's interesting to wonder why the majority of criticism of Mass Effect 3 myopically fixated on the writing, not the design of the game. I think this trend suggests that we may have an important collective blind spot. Culturally, at time of recording, it seems we overestimate the importance of writing relative to design in a video game story. That writers make this mistake, it's no wonder. They're, of course, going to be prone to overestimate the importance of their own profession, and I think that's the kind of mistake that anybody is going to make when it comes to their chosen profession. Yet it's revealing that so many of us who are not writers make this mistake too. How much do we, as players, critics, and developers, collectively understand the relatively new mediums of video games and RPGs? Evidently, far less than we think. We think writers matter in this medium far more than they actually do. I find this actually quite encouraging. It means we have much left to learn, and the best games are not behind us. No, the best games are yet to be made. It seems the medium of video games is still so new that we're prone to judge it by the standards of older storytelling mediums, where writers' primary importance is usually taken for granted, such as novels or television shows. But video games are their own art form, and as we've seen, writers aren't the kings in this medium. So we should analyze the design of games if we want to play and make better games. On the one hand, the more we learn to appreciate what is unique to video games, the more in turn we can better appreciate what is unique about other artistic mediums. And on the other hand, quite practically, if we don't learn to better analyze video games on their own terms, other developers will repeat Bioware's mistake instead of learning from it. And none of us want that. And all of that is why I think only a redesign can fix what made Mass Effect 3 disappoint so many, not a rewrite.
A better Mass Effect 3, the future of Mass Effect games, and the future of this channel.
It would have been wiser if Mass Effect 3 used as its core mechanic the alignment system of prior games. Then it might satisfy returning players' aesthetic expectations. It could evoke the kinds of feelings the older games did. Still, because players rightly expect sequels not just to feel aesthetically similar, but also to make improvements in the dynamics or mechanics, just using the old alignment mechanic would not be enough. Some redesigning of it would be necessary. So, how could that work? As I said at the start of this video, that's just a new can of worms, and it's something that deserves to be focused on in its own video. A video I will make. I want this to be the first in a series of videos on Mass Effect. I do want to explore other subjects not related to video games later, but my next video is going to explore the flaws with the Paragon and Renegade system, and what kind of redesign it needs. After that video, I want to make one about a rewrite of Mass Effect 3, the kind of rewrite I think you might get if you used my redesign. I think it's important to show what a redesign and rewrite could look like. I'm not saying I'm going to be providing a perfect example of what should have been done in either instance. I'm just trying to provide an example of what would have been better, and what would have been in the ballpark of plausibly satisfying returning players. I think this matters because otherwise it's too easy to keep dismissing old school alignment mechanics as outdated, and give in to the very common sour grapes pessimism that Mass Effect 3 was always doomed. Because if we want new RPGs with branching alignment choices across games, we need to suggest how this could be done without ending in a bummer mess. And in truth, I'm also the kind of person that isn't content merely diagnosing problems. I like to fix things. It's who I am. And seeing how the switch to TMS was a mistake makes me interested in fixing the alignment mechanic. I believe there's probably multiple ways you could redesign it, all of which would make for cool rewrites. Finally, I'd like to do a retrospective on what I think this means for the future of the franchise. At time of shooting, there's another Mass Effect announced. Will it release? Will it be good? Will the franchise die if it's bad? What does it even mean for a future Mass Effect game to be good? In brief, I think that future Mass Effects can only hope to justify their existence with new alignment mechanics. That old school alignment mechanic uniting your choices across multiple games, hell, it may be a scarlet letter in today's gaming culture, but it's the only thing that makes Mass Effect as a franchise unique, rather than another generic AAA sci-fi RPG like Starfield that you will forget about in a year. In the end, what makes Mass Effect feel the most like Mass Effect? The combat, the story, your crew, Shepard? Nah. All of that's just a cipher. All of that's just a way to express the alignment mechanic. And that right there, it's the core fantasy of Mass Effect as a brand and IP. Multiple games reacting to your alignment choices. And because of that, I don't think it's an accident that the games with limited or no alignment mechanics disappointed so many people. Just look at Mass Effect 3 and look at Mass Effect Andromeda. Yeah, these games had other notable problems, but arguably their biggest mistake was de-emphasizing the core fantasy of the franchise, the thing that makes Mass Effect games unique, the thing that makes them memorable next to other AAA RPGs. So whether you love the old school alignment mechanic, or you hate it, or you have mixed feelings, which is how I feel, I think the future of this franchise is inextricably tied into the legacy of that old mechanic. And rather than shun that legacy, Bioware needs to update it and make more alignment-based Mass Effects that have no peers. Or, perhaps more realistically, some other developer than Bioware can get inspired and lean into unique alignment mechanics. If Baldur's Gate 3's recent critical and commercial success shows anything, it's that there's a contemporary hunger for single-player role-playing games that modernize seemingly niche classic RPG mechanics. Hell, Baldur's Gate 3 offers something like Mass Effect 1 and 2's alignment-style roleplay with the Dark Urge character. As that character, you either lean into killing for its own sake, or you strive to reject your overwhelming urge. If it's uncommon to develop AAA games like Mass Effect 1 and 2 today, that's more because the wrong industry lessons were learned from Mass Effect 3, not because there's no such market for these games. Moral ambiguity, it's fun role-playing, that's for certain. That's why we love RPGs like The Witcher 3. But as much as we love the gray of moral ambiguity, we also love the clarity of black and white. People love the thematic focus and narrative control only an alignment-based RPG can offer. Mass Effect's alignment system, therefore, isn't outdated game design. It's always going to have appeal. It just needs better execution. And I think we can all agree that the alignment system had a lot of room to be improved. So in the end, there's really no reason why we can't have better Mass Effect 1 and 2 style games. Now, to close this all out, a tiny bit about me. This is my first YouTube video. I intend to make more, each better than the last, and eventually on other subjects like Mass Effect, like the differences and similarities between old and new Star Trek, or maybe the development of Ralph Waldo Emerson's political philosophy, or how the game design of Hades encourages players to experiment, and so on and so forth. But making this video from the day I committed to it to the day this video uploaded, it took a year. Creating stuff is hard, especially when you're new to it and you make lots of mistakes along the way, right? So please, if you enjoyed this, let me know. We're all mortal after all, and I want to know if this is something you find meaningful. I want to spend my time creatively making things that inspire and excite curiosity. And feedback's really the only way I can tell if I'm using my time in effective service to this goal. So if you're curious about me exploring these topics or enjoyed this video, please help me out. I want to make more video essays, but better and more often. And you can help make that happen by commenting on this video, sharing it, liking it, subscribing to my channel, and most consequentially, by funding my Patreon for more videos. In the future, patrons can expect to help me decide what video I'll be working on after I finish up this Mass Effect series. I've got too many ideas, and I'm just curious what you all care about. Well, that's all for now. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, but I should go.
Want something else to watch?
I anticipate it being a couple of months before I put out my next video. I'll link to it right now if it exists. But if it doesn't yet, I figure you might want more thought-provoking Mass Effect or game design stuff. So to wet your whistle, give you a little amuse-bouche, here's my recommendations for you. I'd recommend 3 video essays by GMTK. GMTK is short for Game Maker's Toolkit. The channel is run by Mark Brown, and in general it explores how we can better design games. The first video I'd recommend is titled How to Think Like a Game Designer. This video uses the MDA framework as its starting point, and it's where I first learned of the theory. This video is good. It does exactly what it says in the title. It uses many examples from different games to help you learn to think better and more like a designer. The second video I'd recommend is Should Designers Listen to Negative Feedback? This video points out the various mistakes one can make in taking creative feedback. If you want to think more clearly about how Bioware should have perhaps taken creative feedback, or how to take feedback from others in your own creative projects, I would recommend this video strongly. There's a lot of useful ideas here to apply whether or not you're a game designer. I'd say if you're engaged in any creative endeavor where feedback can improve the product you're working on, this video is definitely worth still checking out. Finally, I'd recommend the video Commanding Shepard. This video is a deep dive on the design of the Mass Effect games. I don't agree with everything Mark Brown says here, but this video taught me exciting and not well-known features about the design of the alignment system in Mass Effect 1, which have greatly helped me in my redesign of the alignment mechanic. More generally, I also recommend this video because it's a good video essay on the design of the Mass Effect games, and that makes it a rarity, as the overwhelming majority of video essays are just studying the writing of the franchise. Those are all my recommendations for now. I should go. For real this time.